You give them a bag. It's got snacks.
The great Socrates,
When you're ready.
as Bill and Ted would say.
Coins to, you can use.
I'm just wondering if they, how would they know?
Should we get started? You guys ready for art? All right, super. And thanks again to Bruce for all his help this summer semester. So there was more to tell. There's more to tell, so we couldn't end today. We had more to do, a little bit more, to pay our dues to the proper subject properly, including the Counter-Reformation. Have you guys heard of the Counter-Reformation? That's kind of the response to Martin Luther. So that is important to get to because, of course, this age of the Renaissance kind of comes to an end with the Counter-Reformation, which is when the Catholic Church says, whoa, 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 not literally, although it would be great if they did, the Pope, whoa, 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 and he said, look, all of this nudity, all this paganism, all of this sort of artistic liberty needs to be reined in, and it's not just that, it's not just this church, understanding that maybe art has gone a little too far. That's just the surface, right? Underlying that is a criticism of Martin Luther's influence on Catholicism. And so there is kind of this, it's not a holy war, but it's not a civil war, but it is like a cultural war that takes place. And you could say there's a lot of really interesting parallels to the world we live in today with sort of Catholic, Protestant, right? Kind of big end. You remember Gulliver's Travel, the people who ate the egg on the big end versus and I think that was a criticism of the sort of nature of religious strife, right? That people have these sort of insurmountable differences based on religion, and how silly that we can't just live in peace because, there's no way to reconcile those differences. Because if you try, you're going to sort of run in a circle, right? So you either hate each other or you figure out a way to live in peace in spite of those sort of, like take abortion, for instance, right? There you go. Take abortion. Like you can't really resolve that. You have to decide where life begins and agree to that. And someone might say, oh, it begins here. Someone might say, and it's very hard to come to some agreement. As you probably know. So it's very tricky with a lot of these issues, and I think the minister alluded to some of that. So I think it's really helpful to think about how a lot of this era we're going to be talking and continue talking about, sort of the beginning of the war between Protestantism and Catholicism, is very similar to, I think, things going on today with, I think, people, navigating based on ideology or based on politics and I think what's so interesting about this era is the United States becomes a sort of resolution to that conflict, right? Because the United States says, look, let's just live in peace and agree to disagree. It's okay to agree to disagree as long as we sort of, all live in one society. And I think the United States is very much the expression of this idea that people can live in harmony in spite of those differences. And in a way, you have to kind of see the separation of church and state as part of that, right? I think the separation of church and state, which I'm getting a little ahead of ourselves, is part of the idea of, look, the state shouldn't have one official religion, because if you do, then everyone has to follow that religion, and if everyone doesn't, then they're bad guys and you have war, right? So separating church and state isn't just secularizing the world, but rather acknowledging that maybe faith should be private. Faith is your personal thing, and that's cool because that's Martin Luther, right? Basically, you don't need the church. You just need your own direct access to God through the book, right? So that's really powerful. Now, how does art fit into that? Well, it's easy to sort of look at art as kind of to sort of throw it out with the sort of Protestant criticism of the church, right? And I don't think Martin Luther was really upset about art. I don't think, by the way, I think I said 72 theses. I think it was 95. So he's basically tweeting, right? That's what he's doing when he's posting those, those 95 theses. He's going on Twitter and, getting everyone upset because he's, saying things that a lot of people don't like. I can't remember what all 95 theses were. I don't think anyone ever read all 95. But 94 and 95 were probably the big ones. The sale of indulgences, criticizing the church. So remember, the church, the Pope is in Italy, and he has people going up north to northern Europe and asking people for money to help. Why did they want the money? So the sale of indulgences, right? But to build what? Right, to restore St. Peter, I think, to make a new St. Peter's. Constantine had built old St. Peter's in Rome, and it was kind of falling apart by this time in the 1400s, 1500s. I can't say how much it was falling apart, but I can imagine, icons falling down and, dripping from the ceiling and all kinds of things like that. Welcome. So the church needs to kind of rebuild after the Black Death. We talked about that, but also the fall of Constantinople. So that's really, the fall of Constantinople means Rome is now the epicenter, the only epicenter of Catholicism, of Christianity. of course, you can't really, when I say Catholicism, at this point, there's really no distinction between Lutheranism, emerging sort of distinction between this new wave of sort of, we don't need the church, we can read the book directly, and then, of course, the Catholic Church wanting to, deepen its control over everyone's sort of spiritual destinies. So they want to rebuild this church, and that's kind of what we're going to be talking about, how this sort of the rebuilding of the church overlaps with, of course, the history of the church rebuilding after the Black Death. But of course, at this point, the genie's kind of out of the bottle. The Protestant Revolution is sort of this unstoppable wave. And so how do the artists fit into this? Because, of course, Martin Luther's 1517, that's when he posts the Theses. But there's already, I think, an undercurrent of people reading books, people getting more literate, people reading the Bible, and having just more of a direct access to God. And what does that mean for art? Does that mean art becomes irrelevant? Well, in a way, art is sort of, it's evolving, right? Originally, we're talking about artists visualizing the Bible for the illiterate. But I think we've moved kind of another era where the church is using art to enhance its own bona fides, right? To legitimize the authority of the church, maybe even for propaganda. But I think also to reconcile the past and the present, because Italy is now the sort of trying to celebrate its own heritage, whereas before it sort of really stifled all that paganism and really tried to kind of put that in the past. Now they're like, well, hold on. I think we can kind of juggle all those balls together. And that's kind of what we're looking at here. So this is the School of Athens. And I'm not going to spend too much time on Raphael, because even though I love his painting, I'm not gonna even go there. I'm not gonna criticize Raphael because I'm still trying to figure out why I don't like him as much as Michelangelo. Now he did die at 37, so maybe poor guy didn't live long enough to really reach the greatness of Michelangelo. But for sure, Michelangelo didn't like Raphael because he was so talented and kind of was a threat to Michelangelo's sort of own uniqueness as the superstar. And he was a superstar. He's the first celebrity artist who could achieve things in spite of maybe controversy because he was so famous, so well known. So this is Raphael's famous painting, School of Athens. When you look at it, do you see anything Christian about it? Anything conspicuously Christian? No, not really, right? Now, this was painted by the church, for the church, in the church. So this is, these two artists, Raphael, Michelangelo, for sure are sort of institutional celebrities. You can't separate the church from their own artistry. And so I think both of them, it's a moment to kind of think about how their subject matter relates to these things that we just talked about, the changes going on, the church rebuilding. So what do you guys see when you look at this? What do you note about it? What's the first question you might want to ask when you're looking at this? What do you think, Dean?
Is this the one that he put Michelangelo's face
Yes,
there?
he put all that. This is like
a bagel?
it's like if you asked AI to generate a picture showing all the celebrities from the ancient world and the contemporary world and put them all on stage for a curtain call. That's kind of like what we're looking at here. This sort of impossible moment where time dissolves and you have all these people who are on stage who shouldn't really be there because they're separated by centuries, and including people who are there from the present day, brushing shoulders with people from the ancient world. I think Apollo is also there. That's Apollo on the left there. So gods are sharing the stage with, contemporary, divine-like figures who've reached that status because of their artistry. So this is Michelangelo right here. There's Socrates. I think Raphael put himself in the painting there on the right. Guns N' Roses used that as part of the album cover back in the 90s. So, they needed to be all, sophisticated, so they did that, not knowing that Nirvana was about to supplant them. So anyways, I digress. So yes, Dee, we are looking at kind of a concoction of people from the present world, the contemporary era of Raphael, and he's acknowledging the contributions of his peers, even though probably in person they snided at each other because there's a lot of competition between them. So what else would you ask? Would you look at this? What else anything?
When I look at that, I would say it's kind of a testament to man as opposed to God. I mean,
right.
You see the God and you see the huge
Great.
people and you see the huge.
Yeah, so I think you can relate that to humanism. So you could see this as a shift away from the spiritual realm to the material worldly realm. And that's not necessarily in conflict with the idea of God. It's more saying, look, we're not going to focus on the afterlife, but rather making the present life better, right? And I think there's a lot of value. I think you could say that fits right in nicely with Lutheranism and Calvinism, the idea of sort of not focusing especially on just sort of buying your way into afterlife, is kind of what the Catholic Church was saying in a way, but rather, focusing on making the world better and sort of in the world we live in. Not materialism, but rather just saying we have value in the life that we're living here. We can make the world better and honor God in that way. I think that's kind of the idea here.
I really see materialism.
Okay, material,
I look at
interesting.
that structure, and I don't see God. I just see.
No, yeah, absolutely. There's no really
people, and
anything
I see what
conspicuous
they've
here.
done.
There's nothing conspicuously Christian here, right? So the question is, what on earth is Raphael doing painting? In fact, we're looking at Socrates and Aristotle. So why would the church condone something like this when there's nothing, no Jesus, no Virgin Mary, no Annunciation, no angels? So what do you think? And we have kind of touched on this a little bit. So you have to kind of think about the fall of Constantinople, right? And also the idea of celebrating these roots that were up until this point kind of, they distance themselves from these roots. So I think you really have to see this as a moment where the church is sort of expanding its umbrella and saying, instead of kind of denigrating this past, we're going to celebrate it and let it kind of occupy space together. Now, they didn't put there's nothing really conspicuously Christian here, because I think at this point the idea is basically this is all a celebration of the past and the present, and they're not even filtering it through a kind of Christian lens, because I think this shows just how far these artists have kind of gone in the other direction, away from sort of the rejecting paganism to seeing it as somehow part of this overall Christian story going all the way back to the ancient world. So it's kind of like when Dante writes his Inferno, right? And he has to decide, well, what do I do with all these people who were born before Jesus? Do I put them in hell? Or do I say, well, they didn't know better, and that's, very tricky. Like, how do you sort of reconcile the two? So I think what we're kind of looking at is the church saying, look, we accept this past now. We don't reject it. We don't condemn it, okay? So I think that's the kind of overarching idea here. But I think what's interesting for me is, as they're sort of trying to reconcile these two worlds, they're kind of, opening up cans of worms, unleashing genies from the bottles and that kind of stuff. And we're looking at Socrates and Aristotle here. And I think what's so interesting, well, what would you say about them, looking at them? What do you think is noteworthy about them?
It's very God, Jesus looking.
Yeah, so I think there is kind of an underlying sort of Christian quality of the wearing togas. Remember, Christianity looks a lot like Rome because, of course, Rome gave rise to, Christianity. Eventually, Constantine converted. So it's, the angel we saw, the Nikes, there's a lot of blurring between, it doesn't just sort of break from one to the next. There's a sort of gradual shift from one aesthetic to the next. And so the robes, the sandals, there's a lot of qualities that feel very familiar, right? But so what about their expressions? You've got one guy kind of doing this and one guy doing this. And this is very interesting for me because you're kind of looking at two worldviews side by side, Socrates and Aristotle. I think it's Plato and Aristotle. So, Plato, the Platonic dialogues are very interesting because it's sort of like ethics and sort of the nature of knowledge. His whole point was asking questions to get to Socrates at least, asking questions to get to the underlying assumptions that people have. But it all preceded Christianity. So there's nothing really Christian about it. So the question might be, is Raphael trying to somehow blend classical thought or make it compatible with Christian thought? So the symbolism of these two figures is basically, one guy's, what do you think he's saying by doing this? Like, what does this body language tell you? What's that?
Stop.
Stop. Yeah, it does catch like a kid. Stop. Leave me alone. And what about him right there? What's this? I'll get back to that in a moment.
Making a point.
What's that?
Making a point.
Good, and literally point. He's kind of like Doubting Thomas. He's always pointing in the air. So what you've got here is one guy who's pointing up to heaven, and one guy who's pointing down to earth. And this goes back to your materialism point, because basically what Raphael is doing is saying this is the duality of human nature, that you've got idealism and you've got realism, right? And you can use different words to kind of distinguish between one and the other. But basically, when I look at this, like, okay, Democratic Party, Republican Party. We've got one party that's like, we can make the world better, and another party is like, yeah, but don't not pass this bedrock foundation that is fundamental. So basically, one's like, this is the unbreakable foundation that we can't deviate from, and the other's like, well, no, we can make it a little better. And of course, you need both. You need idealism and sort of realism, but that's the sort of him distilling the nature of philosophy and I think truth down to this two kind of eternal opposites. Good, or not good, but grounded versus sort of floating in the air, right? So, but again, I think the key thing that you point out is this is a shift back to that kind of materialism, the worldly naturalism with the human body. Things are grounded on the floor; they're not floating in the air. So this is really kind of that extreme moment in the Renaissance where things go really so far away from anything conspicuously Christian that this is the very thing that I think a lot of the cardinals and bishops will start criticizing because there's no Jesus, right? There's no Virgin Mary. So it's almost like this is going too far. So keep that in mind as we look at Michelangelo. Here's one of his early paintings. Not many people have seen this. It doesn't really look like Michelangelo, right? It's not very Sistine Chapel-y. Now keep in mind, Michelangelo saw himself as a sculptor and not really as a painter, although I think he's a better painter than the other artists at the time too. And I think this picture is very interesting because it kind of shows this guy tormented by a bunch of demons, right? Being like taken off of a cliff. So there's interesting parallels with sort of, I think, personal story of someone feeling an inner conflict about their faith. I think you could see some foreshadowing about sort of how do you reconcile Martin Luther with the Catholic Church if you're someone like Michelangelo? Maybe you hear that there's all this, there is some value to the criticism of the church, but of course, you don't want to bite the hand that feeds you, and the hand that feeds Michelangelo is definitely the church. He's not getting his money from private sources like some of these other artists. It's really the church that's funding these artists, and you're lucky if you're a Raphael and they identify you as a superstar artist and they elevate you sort of up to the big leagues, and the rest is history. So you're not going to bite the hand that feeds you, but I think these artists each have to kind of figure out how to find that balance between, serving God, serving the church, serving your own sort of truth. Now, this is not a Michelangelo, but he was there when they dug this up. So Michelangelo in 1500s was there, like Indiana Jones, watching them unearth all of this. So literally, they're unearthing the classical world, revealing it to people who had never seen this for thousands or 1,000 years because it's buried underground. So there's a metaphorical sort of resurrection of the ancient world, but literally, they're also bringing these sculptures out of the ground. And when Michelangelo sees this, he's blown away because, it's very impressive. This is actually a sculpture of the guy who told the Trojans, don't bring the Trojan horse into, don't bring the Greek Trojan horse into Troy because it will destroy us all. And Athena sent a snake to basically pull him and his children into the ocean because you're not supposed to stop the will of the gods, and the will of the gods is that Troy must fall. And of course, this also kind of relates back to Rome because the Trojans fled Troy and eventually settled Rome. So it's also like they're digging up this ancient sort of prequel to Rome's history here, and it really originates with Troy. So, Rome is kind of celebrating its own roots. Pardon me, question? Which one?
How old is this?
This is probably from about, probably 100 years before Christ or around then. Wow. So very ancient and beautiful. This is from the Alexander the Great era of Hellenism, where they took classical sculptures and made them more dramatic and theatrical. And this kind of stuff was buried underground for 1,000 years, and Michelangelo is part of the excavation party, and just imagine, digging up something like this and seeing it and just being like, and you're a sculptor, you're like, wow, this is really amazing, to the point that some people have actually thought that Michelangelo made this as a kind of, it's not true, but I love theories like that.
Where is that?
This is, I think, got to be somewhere in Europe. Where it was dug up was in Rome. So it's probably still in Rome, but I don't know exactly the location. Somewhere in Italy, I'm sure. But you'd have to look that up. And his name's Laocoon.
Who are the characters in this?
So this is Laocoon, the guy in the middle. He's basically a prophet. This sort of idea, he symbolizes the idea that if you can see the future, you're doomed because no one's going to believe you, and there's nothing you can do about it. And that's kind of what we're seeing, sort of someone who's tragically can see the future and is punished by the gods. But you could also see kind of some Christ-like qualities to it too. Someone suffering, almost like Christ on the cross. So there's a lot, and I think all that is definitely something that I think Michelangelo's thinking. He's like, wow, there's something here that's maybe hard to see, but something there, something meaningful. And to reconcile this world with the Christian world is a very interesting sort of endeavor. I think there is a lot of you gotta love how it's biting into his.
Alex, do you know if when this was discovered, had Michelangelo already done a fair amount of his sculpture?
Yeah. So he's like, it must have been like, I can't think of a great analogy for it, but sort of digging up the ground, just discovering the very thing that you're so passionate about, and it's like you're literally, just what an exciting time to kind of give yourself permission to not just see this and be like, we need to destroy it because it's pagan, but rather, oh no, there's something beautiful here. Let's celebrate it and fit it into our sort of Christian worldview. And I think that's kind of what you're going to see when we look at the Pietà. So he made this 1 year before the discovery of that one we just saw.
Before,
So he already is making sculptures. I think this is one of the greatest sculptures ever. This is really impressive sculpture. I used to think it was very small, which I was really bummed about, but then I found it was much bigger. So I need to get back to Italy, obviously. So let me ask you about this. So when you see this, I mean, what a evolution we've gone from, Annunciations and the early versions of Jesus as a little boy. So what do you think when you look at this? What do you notice about this, or what comes to mind, or
The emotion of it.
what's that?
The emotion of it.
Yeah, the emotion I think is really a powerful. So imagine, Michelangelo's working on this, and then he sees this. You can really kind of see that he's like, oh, that's exactly what I'm doing. The emotion, the sort of that inner life, or the sort of storytelling. So emotion. Where do you see the emotion here?
The mother.
Mary's face.
Sorry, but where don't you see the emotion? Right? Yeah. So it's like she's sort of accepting this moment. I think that's the power, like almost like Jesus in the Last Supper. She's very kind of like she's showing her fortitude, right, in the face of this tragedy, right? So let me ask you a question. I ask my students this at UT. Is Jesus alive here, or is he completely, has he left the world here? Is he still? So obviously, I wouldn't ask if there wasn't a little bit of room for maybe another point of view. So what do you think if I said maybe he's still alive?
No, they took him off the cross. He's dead.
Okay.
On the
All
cross.
right. No, I'm with you. I think that's very,
Yeah.
according to technical, theological.
Well, technical and scientific, when they talk about, when Jesus was pierced in his side, that was to prove he was really dead.
Right,
The water and the blood
right.
separated.
So that's great. That's awesome. Michelangelo, Mike could also be like, okay, that's cool. I'm going to sculpt what I sculpted, right?
Yeah,
That's the
yeah,
artistic
yeah.
liberty, right? So knowing, and again, it's an opportunity to see kind of, is it wrong if he's not, strictly adhering to the word, right? So if I were to say there's some sign that Jesus here still has some life, where is it?
Arm.
So what do you mean by that?
It's bent.
It's bent. So the arm being bent, there's a kind of, he's showing
There's
some,
muscle control.
okay, muscle control. Right, where else?
Interesting.
Calf.
What's that?
Calf.
Calf, okay, good. Go a little lower, because the calf is kind of connected to, so everyone take one of your feet.
Left foot's curled.
Yeah, so take your foot and try to replicate what Jesus is doing with his left toe. And you agree that it feels like, a relaxed, dead foot doesn't have the toes curled, right? I don't know if you see that on the left side.
Yeah.
And where else? Well, what about this right hand? You see what's going on there?
Is your finger moving?
He's slightly pinching his fabric there, right? Now, I'm not saying, like, maybe someone looked at this and they said, Michelangelo, you read the story wrong. And we'll see in a moment that Michelangelo seems to not take much interest in being too slavishly strict to, we'll see that in a moment. So I think you could make an argument that Michelangelo's like, okay, but I'm going to do it this way.
Yeah.
And I think there's a certain merit here if you just look at the sculpture, free from the theology, that sort of it heightens the emotion here, right? I think it's all the more powerful that's like Jesus is not actually passed away, but they sort of clinging to life, clinging to his mother, right? Which is very powerful, right?
I can't see the head. Is the head missing?
So his head is kind of, I should have had a few other perspectives, but he's kind of falling back, and so his head is kind of vanishing as he's kind of, so it's in a way, it's like emphasizing the body's anguish and not his face. I think it's part of the power that Michelangelo doesn't use the face as a source of emotion, but Jesus' sort of body is a real sort of epicenter of that emotion of his sort of suffering, right? And of course, going back to the mother, he's returning in a way almost to his mother's lap, so kind of coming full circle, right? Going from the Annunciation to here is really like a full evolution of Jesus back to sort of his starting point. But I think the Virgin Mary here is sort of a really powerful moment for her to sort of show that she's accepting, and I think that's the contrast between the two, sort of kind of very lifeless, but sort of someone who's stable and grounded.
Going back to the one right before, one thing I don't understand is the musculature
Yeah.
of this 100 years before Christ, when, there's so much research about how Da Vinci and Michelangelo started cutting cadavers to see how the muscles move and everything. The knowledge of that is evident in this.
Yeah, well, even the other sculptors, they're definitely using they're doing things that no artist could have done 100 years prior because of the church's restrictions on dissections. And I think anatomy wasn't so, they weren't, because this goes back to what you were saying about the shift to materialism. there was, for many hundreds of years, as we kind of saw, people were sort of more spiritual. They're flat, they were floating in the air. There was a spiritual emphasis, whereas now we're more emphasizing what the Romans saw, which is the body, the physical body, the grounded. So that's why the
That
Renaissance.
much sophistication 100 years before.
Yeah. Oh no. I mean,
1,000
it's
years,
it's
right?
incredible what they did during the Roman time with sort of
So,
mastering anatomy.
We got 100 years before Christ.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So when Michelangelo is in the 1500s, or
Right.
1400s, right?
Right,
So
15.
it's almost,
1,500 years.
it's
from
Yeah.
that.
1500
Yeah.
years before.
Right.
that this
Marvel
was
ages
created.
very well, as you can see.
Yeah.
And you know, by the way, a lot of these sculptures were painted. As horrible as it sounds to imagine some of these things painted, a lot of them were. I don't know if this one specifically, but when you do see them painted, it's pretty horrible. It's like, yeah, you know, we'll forget that they ever painted some of these sculptures. The paint often doesn't survive, but of course the underlying sculpture does. Yeah, very powerful. And I agree. It's really neat to think that these artists of the Renaissance are finding a lot of value in this, you know, the struggle, the passion, the emotion. But of course, none of this is Christian, and yet it's so almost, you can see how it's so, can be so easily absorbed as long as you give yourself permission to kind of try to reconcile the two. Now, that's not to say that they're completely reconcilable, but I think that's part of the joy of this era. You know, the Jesus is clothed, he's given sort of the dignity of the clothing here. In other cases, nudity is very like on display. Now here's, going back to what you were saying a moment ago, this I think is where Michelangelo's like, okay, nope. I'm going to do it my way. So what do I mean by that? Who are we looking at here?
David.
Right, everyone's probably seen this. I think this is in Florence, in the Uffizi Gallery, right? So I remember I was blown away when I saw it. Absolutely amazing, right? So what about this is pagan? It's not a pagan guy, because he's David, Old Testament, right? So, but what about this is a little like kind of blending the two? Yes.
Very much of a testament to man.
Right, so you could say this is really all about the grounded, material, physical, very much sort of a celebration of, you know, beauty of the physical body, absolutely. So there's definitely that kind of shift towards, like you said, the sort of material. What else is very, like, pagan about it?
Well, he's naked.
There's,
nothing in the
really?
story.
He's naked?
There's
Right.
nothing in the story that indicates David was naked.
Right, and
Right?
as someone who's never served in the army but has common sense, I would never go to battle.
Naked.
No, at least put underwear on, at the very least. So, you know, and David, you know, God bless David. He really doesn't seem to mind that he's totally naked. That, I think, is really one of his great strengths here, that he doesn't seem to be aware that he's nude. So everyone else, I'm sure, is like, put some clothes on, please. Now, what else is notable about this? So first, we agree, nudity, certainly that's not something you would really expect to see, except I think at this time they're celebrating. You know, I didn't point this out because it's not really a Greek art class, but the Greeks saw nudity as heroism, heroic. So nudity was really heroic. But the Romans came along like, no more nudity, and that's why you got the toga in a lot of Christianity. So this is kind of scraping away even the Roman, going back to the Greek kind of emphasis on nudity as corresponding to heroism. So what else about this? So you don't really have a human being for scale, but you got the building to show how big it is. So what do you know about the story of David?
That he was small.
Very small guy up against
A giant.
a giant, right? Michelangelo. I don't care.
I just heard recently that one hand is obviously larger than the other. Maybe that's the one used for the slingshot
Right.
to have greater strength.
Yeah, and it's pretty, it seems like, yeah, and it's definitely, I think that right hand there, it looks really, I mean, you can even tell, it's really big. And so, yeah, not only did he seem to not even read the story, which I'm sure he did, but I think that's an interesting question. He also is kind of playing with anatomy. It looks like it's maybe anatomically accurate, but in fact, he's playing around with proportion to kind of make it all work. And in fact, this is what they did during the Alexander the Great era. So they went from accuracy to let's exaggerate things for emotional impact. And so he's really taking a page from this playbook here, where it's all about kind of, you know, because those guys, those look like little adult men, not children. You notice they're not really even children. And that's an interesting question for me. I ask my students, why portray his children as little adult men? And it might be, well then, because maybe the Romans were like, it's too cruel to be that mean to children, you know, drag the children, so make them look like adult men. I don't know. We don't have the artist answer. But those are the kinds of liberties artists can take for various reasons. I think with David, yes, he's not being accurate so much as expressive and emotional and trying to kind of impart a message to you. And I think that's an interesting question to ask you. What is the message of this? Why is he making David look like Goliath? I mean, it's not only he's big, he's like
Yeah, but
Arnold Schwarzenegger. So I don't think Goliath's going to win this fight, unless Goliath's even bigger than the story. So why show David this way? He doesn't look like a little. There is a version of David by Donatello. He's a little puny, like little guy with a little hat on. It's pretty ridiculous sculpture, in fact. I'm sorry I didn't bring it. I'll show it to you next time. So it's almost like Michelangelo didn't either read the story, or maybe he's like, okay, my objective is not to be accurate so much as to, do something else. And I think in this case, David is meant to be a symbol of the city that commissioned this sculpture as a way of symbolizing standing up to the bad guy, whoever, the other cities. There's a lot of competition in Italy. So I think he was commissioned to make this as a symbol of the city that they defiantly stand up against their enemies. So in that sense, it makes sense to maybe inflate David to the point where he looks like Goliath, or even in a modern, postmodern sense, it's like, yeah, you can do whatever you want. Just sort of, he's reinterpreting the story in his own way. And it's up to you to decide whether the most important measurement of quality is it's true to the story, or if it's true to the artist's vision. Now, I'm sure if it's the Pope, he's going to probably err on the side of being true to the church and true to the story, right? But Michelangelo will attain a kind of level of notoriety where I think he really can kind of get away with things that no other artist would dare to get away with. You got to love his expression, very kind of stern and focused. It's very powerful, and in a way that's almost hard to understand why it's so powerful. And his shifting the weight on the one leg is straight out of the sort of ancient Roman playbook. Egyptians would not have their sculptures kind of very rigid and stiff like this. But then the Greeks came along and like relaxed the sculptures and made them sort of look very human-like. And even the gods look very human-like because they have that same anatomy. So, the Greeks were trying to reconcile divinity with humankind, man showing God with human forms. It's similar to the idea of sort of reconciling Christianity to sort of the ancient world.
Would it be a testament to not his stature in human form, but maybe his contribution?
Yeah,
to,
great. Yeah,
the
symbolism
Bible
of his
and
size.
civilization
Yeah,
and
his correspond. You could say his size corresponds to his significance as sort of Father David. I think he was kind of not a great guy, right?
No, he was mostly a great guy.
Mostly a
And
great
it
guy.
went down all down.
To be mostly a great guy is good enough for
Well,
me.
he was known as a man after God's own heart.
Okay.
So
Okay.
he's someone to look up to, but he also had all the foibles and all
Right.
the bad things.
Right, and that all makes him all the more relatable because whenever you have a movie where like Captain America can never get hurt, you don't care about Captain America because he's not relatable anymore, right? So that's a mistake they make in a lot of movies where you got to have a weakness for me to really care because then the stakes matter, or else it's just like pew pew pew, bullets just bounce off. So it's a powerful sculpture.
How did the church receive it?
Well, I think you have to understand that this wasn't commissioned by the Pope, and I have a feeling the Pope would never have commissioned, and we'll see in a moment with the Last Judgment, there are a lot of people, by the time of the mid-1500s, a lot of people were upset about the nudity. So this is the exact kind of thing that when the Counter-Reformation comes along, even though they're criticizing Luther, they'll also have time, they'll have like a day or two of talks and roundtable discussions, criticize artwork for being too pagan, too much liberty, and they'll want to rein in the artists by the mid-1500s, which is why we have to talk about Caravaggio and others. But by then, the world of art has already shifted to other secular subjects, So, the church is kind of, it's kind of one of those moments where the church wants to keep control, but it's already like, the feathers are out of the pillow kind of thing. But this is absolutely the kind of thing that, nudity, full-on nudity with a biblical subject, I mean, that's a big no-no, right? Mm-hmm. Nevertheless, he gets away with it because I think he's such a kind of powerful artist. And I think a true believer, he's not like faking it. He's really a committed Christian. But I think he has this understanding. There's a conflict between the church's corruption and the merits of Luther's criticism.
Where do these sculptures, and maybe that one in particular, where was it commissioned to?
I think it was Florence, and I think it was meant to be standing up to them. What I read today was a Medici, which I thought, they were the ones who really who nourished his talents and celebrated him. But I think, the church was not, the Medici until they actually got a pope into there. The Medici figured out a way to get a pope, to get like Godfather III when they, install one of the family members into the, powerful institution. Well, similarly, I think that, Italy was a whole mess of different states and republics. Rome was invaded in 1527 by the Spanish, who are now on the rise because of Columbus and, Cortez. So there's a lot of conflict in Italy for sort of supremacy between the church, the different towns. Remember, that was also part of the pilgrimage route. So each town on the pilgrimage route to Rome want to outdo each other with a better church, a bigger cathedral, more relics of Jesus' bones kind of thing. And likewise, having a statue that symbolizes their standing up to the other city-states and maybe even the Pope or whoever. I think in this case, though, it was standing up to the Medici family, which was becoming very powerful to the point where they, I think, like I said, I think Pope Alexander was one of their clan members. Now, I don't know if they're still famous. I know Ferragamo does shoes. I don't know if Medici still has their same, banking, merchants, definitely taking advantage of the sort of conflict with Islam. And here we got what are we looking at here? Where is this? St. Peter, right? Lovely sunset here. In the foreground is the colonnade built by Bernini, which we'll talk in another day. That wasn't there when St. Peter's was built, but the dome was designed by Michelangelo. And St. Peter's itself, I think we talked about it briefly, it's almost ridiculously large. In fact, I would say it is ridiculously large. I mean, look at how tiny the people are next to the building. I mean, that's such a big, colossal church. It's like the Hagia Sophia, in Constantinople, formerly Constantinople. So huge, right? And this is exactly the kind of thing when you look at churches here, like this church, it's defiantly not this. I think that's the whole point, right? What would Martin Luther be criticized? The sale of indulgences to build this church. Well, I think he's basically saying, why are we taking money from the poor to build this lavish church when maybe there's not enough food to eat, maybe better ways of spending your money. Kind of like when they want to build a new stadium here, there's always kind of an issue about, well, where's the right way to spend money?
The thing that stood out to me was they had little markers on the floor that said that so-and-so cathedral went this far, and so-and-so cathedral went this far. So they were bragging on the
Literally a church pissing contest
we are
kind of.
bigger
Yeah.
Yeah.
than any of these other
Yeah,
towns.
and I don't think when they get to the pearly gates, God is like, wait,
Yeah.
takes his ruler, his holy measuring stick, not big enough down. Yeah, so yeah, and but size and scale does have a certain symbolism, right? I tend to be, everyone hates me because I'm kind of like, I see the merits of both sides because I understand like the symbolism of here is like you're almost literally looking at heaven. You're looking at like this like entryway to heaven, and of course on the inside, what does it look like? It looks very beautiful, right? The dome you have to appreciate you can't be too close, If you're too close, the dome kind of starts sinking in the back. We'll get back to the dome in a moment.
Wasn't that a replacement of an earlier version?
Yeah, the old St.
Wasn't
Peter's that
it
Constantine built. So going all the way back to 300s, that Constantine moved the capital of Constantinople and built the Hagia Sophia. Well, he didn't build the Hagia Sophia. It was Justinian did. But yeah, he was the one who built old St. Peter. So it was really in need of kind of someone to come along and build a new one. So that's why the church was, raising money to build a new replacement, and they needed one, right? I think, the church definitely needed a fitting replacement for the old St. Peter's, but, that's just sort of like the hubris of kind of raising money means you have to collect it from various people, and that is a recipe for corruption when people are just kind of collecting money from the poor, and, who knows how, people are not perfect, And inside of the church, that's where a lot of the money is being spent on. It looks like almost one of those lobbies in Manhattan where it's just meant to impress you with the reflective gold and all the marble. And I think the idea here is you're like entering heaven, and it meant to symbolize the richness and beauty of heaven. But of course, it also reinforces the authority of the church as sort of like, impressive, overwhelming glamour and glitz. And it is really impressive. But I think also you can understand that it does feel a little bit maybe out of touch, especially when you think of Martin Luther and kind of how the Protestant church, the Puritan movement, really shifts away from that. And when you look at churches that are Protestant, do they look like this?
Yeah.
What do they look like? What color do you think of when you think of a Protestant church? White, right? And white, and that's it. Nothing, maybe a little bit of stained glass, but nothing that's like lavish and says like we have a lot of money. And that's the whole point. I think a real rejection of this kind of lavishness, the material symbolism. But of course, we still have to think about, well, what about art? Is art also lavish and irrelevant when it comes to Luther's criticism? And I guess that's the inside of the dome there. Very similar to Capitol building in the United States, right? And we'll get back to that. I think it's a very interesting subject to think about. Even though we separate church and state, we still have kind of absorbed kind of Christianity into our kind of a Protestant mindset that's underlying our separation of church and state. Ah, I said something wrong. So yes, this colonnade, that's the colonnade that Bernini will go on to build. Bernini's definitely another great, he's almost like Michelangelo, as it kind of could do architecture, painting, and drawing. And also remember, printmaking is on the rise now too. So a lot of these paintings that people will do, like Raphael will do prints of it, and then he'll sell those to people, and they start realizing they can use printmaking to make money, and that also sort of starts, creating tension with the church because they're losing control of the art making. And here I have this, because on the side here you can see the Sistine Chapel, a little kind of chapel to the right of St. Peter's is that little chapel right there. Looks like a scary view right there. And then, of course, inside there, we've got the Sistine Chapel. And I don't know if you remember, I think growing up, I remember them restoring this. It was really sooty, even right up to the 80s. And then, it's really one of those remarkable moments in art history, because once they cleared it off, it's like, oh my gosh, this guy is like the most amazing painter. And he really is, especially because he didn't see himself as a painter. He's a sculptor, and his paintings kind of look sculptural in a way. Now, what are we looking at here? The ceiling, right? And wonderful metaphor. The ceiling is like heaven. And what are we looking at? What are these stories here? Old Testament or New Testament? This is all Old Testament, right? So we're going back to kind of the idea of visualizing the Bible for people who don't have neck pain, right? And I've seen, there's a letter Michelangelo writes with him looking up at the ceiling. And I always thought he lied on his back painting this, right? But I don't know what the truth is. If you're a smart artist, you just tell whatever story you need to tell to make yourself sort of mysterious. And so you got to always take it with a grain of sand, whatever, grain of salt, right?
Are these paintings or frescoes?
Frescoes. So a fresco is painting on dry plaster or drying concrete or plaster as it's drying, right? So they would basically take a big drawing that they've already done, and put on the wall, and either they poke holes and then put charcoal on it. So you're basically taking a sketch, transferring it, and then you have the lines and all sort of like a coloring book in a way, and then you add the paint. It makes life a lot easier. Today you might use a projection, right? You might project something on the wall, and that opens up a whole can of worms about whether or not, a lot of people might say that's less artistic or not, but that's not. Maybe we can have a class dedicated to that. It's not really necessarily Christian, but I think it's interesting to think about what we use to measure the value of an artist. And when you look at this, it's just incredible. Not only just the architecture, but things that look like architecture are paintings, right? A lot of this you might think is a sculpture, but it's actually like so realistic looking that he's made the painting look like part of the architecture. So you might also notice his kind of clarity, and I know it's very small here, but you can see the whole thing. But he kind of gets a little better at making it more clear from us down below as he goes along. And let's get close up so you can see what's going on here. There's some detail. Yeah, really amazing.
He removed the first ones because he got the plaster wrong and it was molding.
Yeah, I think he learned a lot, trial and error kind of thing along the way. Now, there are ways to kind of fix errors, but the idea with fresco is it's kind of unforgiving. You kind of have to commit to it and have a process to do it. Now, this took 4 years, and it's definitely something that made him a celebrity. Like, this was definitely the thing that catapulted him to kind of immortality. And rightly so. Here's the left side with the soot, and they, torchlight, who knows what else, gunpowder, and so that just, to reveal the sort of brightness and the exquisite painting that he did underneath was really a remarkable moment in art. And so who are we looking at here? The big G. We don't see him very much in art, right? And rightly so, because, you're definitely going one way or the other, depending on how you depict him, right? So you got to be careful with depicting the big G, because he's not Jesus, right? He's like higher up, right? So you have to kind of, what are the dilemmas when it comes to depicting God? And by the way, we might get to the Last Judgment next class, because I just don't want to overwhelm you. So we might focus on Sistine Chapel today. But so how do you depict God? What don't you want to do when it comes to depicting God? Well, you might have to avoid maybe nudity, right? Yeah. Maybe don't show him any, you have to kind of make it clear that it's God, but also, not make him too human, right? So that for me explains, well, let me ask you, what do you find kind of notable about God when you see him here? Ignoring the story for a moment. By the way, what is he doing here? This is him separating light and dark.
Oh, okay.
Right? So we were right at the Genesis here, Old Testament, right? So in the beginning, and so here's dark and here's light. It's not unlike what an artist does when they start painting. Dark and light, that's the starting point. Darkest point, lightest point. So it's very interesting parallels of the kind of idea of creation. God as a creator is also an artist, you could say. Also, you think about AI, now I'm going way off the beaten path. So AI is also something where we're creating AI. Why? We're not giving birth to it. We're creating an artificial intelligent thing, right? That's kind of what God did with us, right? He didn't necessarily give birth to us, but he created something that sort of honors God. And it's an interesting parallels with AI and creation and God. Anyways, going back to God, what do you notice about God here? You've already noticed it.
Powerful.
What's that?
Powerful.
He's powerful, right? I think that he's done a good job capturing that. And also his outfit's a little ridiculous, right? He's kind of wearing a pink, I don't know, spandex, pink Lululemon. Why is he wearing that?
To show off his muscles.
Here he's separating the sun and the moon. This is like very Superman pose. You gotta love it. I mean, this is
Is that a butt?
what'd you say?
Is that a butt?
It is, and that I think is one of the most funny moments in all of artistic creation. I don't know if it's God's butt or if it's the spandex are so tight that God's butt is just sort of defined. But what we're looking at is God is like, I'm going here and separating the sun from the moon, and now I'm going that way, and you get a view of my rear end as I go that way. And it's really before and after, right? It's not two gods, it's before and after. So Michelangelo's combining two moments, and he's like whizzing over there like a busy bee, like, I'm going to go do that, and I'm going to go do that. And that's why I think he's showing you that perspective. And it is so funny. If I had a list of funny moments in art, it's because like God's mooning you kind of thing, right? So Michelangelo, when he got to the pearly gates, God was like, Michelangelo. David, great. Last Judgment, okay, good. But, what's up with this?
Yeah.
So I think he didn't get a really nice halo. He got an okay halo. But God was definitely like, okay.
The sun and the moon.
Yeah, and I know, it's funny. I don't think that was intentional. The mooning. Maybe this is the origin of mooning. To moon someone, maybe right here. It goes back to here. But I've always found it so funny. Even the way the sun is depicted is really neat. But yeah, that just sort of him floating away that way is really funny. Yeah. Anyway, we've looked at that. So by the way, that explains his leotard, though. Well, what explains his pink outfit, his pink tight outfit? Well, you don't want him to look like Jesus. You don't want him to look like a human being. And you can't have him in normal everyday clothing because he's God. So the compromise here, I think, is the pink Lululemon outfit. Fortunately for us, Michelangelo realized at some point, okay, maybe that's not quite working for him because we do move on from the pink leotard to what everyone knows. Yeah, really powerful stuff. And notice the people in the back, well, this sort of entourage will continue to expand to the point where we get them all here, right? And look, God is no longer wearing a pink leotard. Now he's wearing like a white sort of tunic or something, which I think is a lot better than the other versions. I do wonder if the Pope was like, Michelangelo, what are you doing? But remember, he's really celebrity at this point. Now, he's earned a lot of enemies because he's so famous, but I think he can kind of make a lot of decisions and without too much, too many people, without the producers sort of nitpicking. And of course, we get to the famous creation of Adam. And what do you notice about this? Or what would you say about this? And we've all kind of seen this before, so. Well, one, I think God breathes life into man. I think he actually uses his breath, Yeah. So Michelangelo breaks from the story again. So again, Michelangelo is not someone who is, a strict to the letter of the law, right? A strict constitutionalist or whatever. So how is man being created here? Touch, right? Touching, like, when I turn on my computer, boom, or when I, push the remote control. So it does feel almost like, adding. Well, what I think is notable about this is Adam looks like he's alive.
Mm-hmm.
Here he is. Yeah, so what do you think, Bruce?
At this point, he's already alive. He's just not God-aware and sentient.
Right, so this is why I think AI is such an interesting thing to think about, because we've got the hardware, we just need to add the software, right? It's kind of like I need to, I've built the robot, but now I need to give it light, turn it on, right? And that's why I think Adam looks so kind of oblivious. He's almost like a little kid who's just sort of like responding to stimulus, but you can just imagine a moment later, he's like, whoa, I'm naked. Well, not quite yet. Obviously, he's not there yet. So he's going to give him consciousness, but like limited consciousness, not like he's going to still make sure he doesn't know good and evil yet. And that's, of course, where the devil comes in. Anything else you notice about this? Well, the background is very unformed, kind of raw material of creation, blue and green. Some people say that God is inside of a brain, like some kind of brain. I like the way the woman there is looking at Adam. For me, that really feels like either that's Eve,
Hmm.
kind of like like her looking, oh, that's the guy, or maybe like a jealous older child who's like, who's this new kid that's coming into the family? But you notice God is floating towards Adam, so there's a kind of like God is almost subordinate to Adam in the sense that he's moving towards Adam as far as like it's not like a hierarchy, but God is the one moving and Adam's just sort of responding. And notice the exquisite anatomy. That's straight out of the David playbook. And now Michelangelo, when we get to the Last Judgment, he's old enough where when he does paint the Last Judgment, which is in the 1520s, 1530s, his style will change by that point, and the world, of course, will change. So we're looking at work by a younger Michelangelo, someone much younger.
Also with this, Adam's getting very little effort. He is just so much repose. Hand is just barely moving. God is stretching. He is coming. He's using a lot of everything to do what he's going to do.
Yeah, that's
In
great.
fact, he's
I love
being
that.
held up by all of these other entities so that he doesn't hurt himself or fall or
No,
whatever.
that's great. The God needs kind of his entourage, his kind of
Right.
spiritual scaffolding, and he's exerting himself quite a bit. No, I love it. And it is almost like he's almost it's a God, man created in God's image. You almost feel like the older version, almost like older version, younger version, father, son. Very interesting. And I think it's it's so neat to see an artist take liberty and say, I'm going to show them touching each other rather than breathing into life. And I'm sure someone might have been like, but hold on, Michelangelo, that's not what the story says. But I think Michelangelo could say, but look, this is very powerful. And so I don't think he had to stick to the story. But of course, the underlying thing, you don't want to necessarily criticize the church. And maybe that's where we get to the Last Judgment, of course. Yeah, so all this would have been sort of transferred on the lines, and then you paint out the rest. I mean, you look at details like this, it's almost like very crude and simple, but of course from far away, all that sort of bleeds together into very cohesive color and all that. He didn't care so much about Eve, right? Because this is Eve. It's not as impressive as the last one, but this is Eve, the birth of Eve. And it's a very bizarre moment because God is now kind of scolding her, and it doesn't look like they've eaten the tree of the knowledge of evil, good and evil yet. So it's a little perplexing, this moment here. But again, it just shows one artist might take more interest in one story or the other, because this is not one that everyone knows, right? You might have never seen this before, right? So it's not as iconic maybe as the last one. But you gotta love how Eve is pleading to him. Any idea what she might be saying? And here we got a redheaded Adam here. I don't know if we've seen redheadedness kind of becomes a sort of stand-in for holiness in this era, it seems. Ginger, as they say. And there, you notice we go from the Sistine Chapel, the top. I guess we have enough time. You guys have a few more minutes. We can do the Last Judgment. We're not literally doing the Last Judgment, just a picture of the Last Judgment. So you can see here the Last Judgment is at the very end of the Sistine Chapel, and this was started 2 decades at least after the Sistine Chapel. So this is the Pope saying, hey, we want you to come back, and we want you to finish sort of what you started, not what you started, but continuity from the Old Testament up here to now we're going to do the Last Judgment. So a lot of people don't know that sort of he took a lot of time in between one and the other, and so that represents a much older Michelangelo who's got all the sort of weight of life kind of inspiring this work, including he got married to a woman who was seeking the reform of the church. So he was married to a woman who was very much pro-reforming the Catholic Church. And in 1527, the Spanish, and I can't remember who else was with them, but they invade Rome and they sack Rome. And you also have Martin Luther with his 95 Theses in 1517. So between the Sistine Chapel and the Last Judgment, you've got the Luther, sort of the Protestant Reformation. And that's definitely something that Michelangelo was aware of. So let's take a look at here it is. There's his unfortunate haircut. Here he's posting his theses onto the wall there. And so, this is the Last Judgment according to Michelangelo. What do you notice about this? Well, one, Jesus is redheaded. Don't have the bearded Jesus. We've got the sort of redheaded pagan Jesus who looks very like macho, or even more like, this is like ridiculous. This is not even steroids. This is like Botero, like this really inflated. And so now Michelangelo's gone away from being accurate to being just expressive with form, and that's really what you're seeing here. Now, is this a peaceful, quiet God, Jesus? This is like either chaotic or wrathful Jesus. So we saw the Last Judgment before the Black Death, and this is kind of a nice update on the Last Judgment. Now, I don't want to go, there's so many Byzantine little details here that are really fascinating and worth looking into. But I think the bigger picture is, well, how does this relate to the other stuff we've talked about today? Well, one, this got a lot of criticism from the church to the point that there's a whole army of people who were called, I think they were called basically like towelers. They were hired by subsequent popes to cover up all the nudity. So a lot of this that you see here is covered up because they hired artists to, incrementally make it sort of more, make the medicine go down easier. So what about this? Well, the nudity particularly. That was one of the first things the Pope was like, and others, like not the Pope, but others, were very critical of the nudity. What else? Well, this is actually hell, but it's shown as kind of Charon and the Greek idea of hell. This is the guy who led, not Charon, what was his name? I think it was actually what it was Charon. He led the dead down to the underworld. So he's blending pagan religion with, that kind of worked because it's hell, so he's kind of putting paganism in hell. But nevertheless, a lot of people criticize this painting. And when they did, you know what Michelangelo did? He put them in the painting with donkey ears. And there's a famous example of this guy here. Yeah, he literally put someone in the painting and making fun of him. Yeah, so this one guy was like, went to the Pope. He's like, Michelangelo, I got a peek at this painting, and it's horrible, nudity, da-da-da. And Michelangelo heard about this as he painted that guy with a donkey head. And so, yeah. That's awesome, actually. If you're in a Michelangelo painting, that's great. So, this was a subject of a lot of criticism, but not until, it's kind of like Back to the Future. They made a deal. They're not going to make a new Back to the Future until the producer's dead, because he's not going to allow them to ruin the movie by, making another Marty McFly. And so you have to wait until Robert Zemeckis dies for there to be a new Back to the Future. So likewise, they had to wait until Michelangelo died before they started, tampering with the painting because he was such a celebrity. So he could kind of get away with things that no one could get away with, like showing Jesus nude. But I think the overall thing that the church, we'll learn about this later today, one of the big parts of the Counter-Reformation in terms of art is no more chaos, no more paganism, no more nudity, but no more chaos. And this is what they're talking about. This is as chaotic as can be. But I think it's a chance for us to go back to the Last Judgment we saw a few weeks ago by Giotto, and this is the one that came before the Black Death. So as I said, this is this is for me what I would expect when I go to a courtroom. I would like a judge who's, rainbow bubbles, sure, either way, yes or no. But, someone who's an orderly courtroom, like going into a classroom where there's order, chairs are all pushed in. There's no detritus on the floor or whatever, no trash. So this feels very clear and orderly. If you believe in Jesus, you're going to heaven. If you don't, you're going to hell. And then Michelangelo comes along with this. So what's different between one and the other? Tell me about the Michelangelo version. How does he show the
It's not crystal clear what's good, what's bad, whatever.
Right. So here it is clear. Right. So he's done something very kind of big, he's definitely, again, Michelangelo's like, I'm going to do it my way, right? So he's not at all adhering to the clarity of this one where it's like up, down. It's kind of a sense of up and down, but not like, okay, they're the good ones, they're the bad ones. Everyone is kind of treated equally. And what else kind of shows everyone being treated equally here? What else do we see on the right one that we definitely don't see on the left? Well, interestingly, the only place you see it on the left is actually on the lower right here. So in the lower right, you actually see people without clothes on in hell, right? What about the other version? Everyone is naked, right? So is that Michelangelo being like, I'm just going to blindly paint? No. Why did he choose to make everyone naked?
Equalize everybody.
Right. It equalized everyone. So this is where I think it goes to the real heart of his, you could say criticism of the church or underhanded or subconscious criticism, because, so much of authority is based on that sort of outward authority, the clothing, the status, the, privilege or whatever. And here he's basically saying, no, everyone underneath is going to face judgment, and God doesn't see your status. He sees right through that, and you're on. And I think that's perfect. Beautiful interpretation of the story, showing everyone nude. But do you think the cardinals and the bishops like being shown nude? Of course not. So he this was painted over numerous times. A lot of people were given clothing, and this is exactly I think the chaos that you're pointing out, the chaotic quality to it, along with the nudity, is exactly what they were criticizing when it comes to the Counter-Reformation. The question, though, I think is, so is there some kind of Protestant, is there a criticism of the church here? Is he criticizing the Catholic Church? Is there something Protestant about this? So let's kind of just go back to some of our other. So you notice we don't see the nations gathered before. So it's really kind of, he's not sticking to the text, the actual text at all. But I think that's fine. This does, but it obviously doesn't have the emotion that Michelangelo has. So these are other versions of the Last Judgment that we've seen. So he really does break from this kind of the orderliness of this, but does so in a way that inspires a reaction from the church. So on one hand, when we learn about the Counter-Reformation, there is a very clear criticism of Luther and his attack on the church, but there's also a kind of acknowledgement that art has gone too far and they need to kind of rein in these artists who are taking too much liberty with nudity, with chaos. And here, in fact, this is supposed to be, people say this is Michelangelo, a self-portrait, referencing one of the famous saints who I think has a skin flayed. That's a bad way to go, right? Having your skin taken off. But that, I think, is supposed to be maybe Michelangelo acknowledging that maybe he has his own sort of, demons that need to be addressed. And you could, I think the interesting question is, so is the Last Judgment, whose Last Judgment is it? Is it, here's some of his anatomy, of course, inspiring some of this stuff. But let me ask you a question. So whose Last Judgment is it? If we think about you could say all of us, but you could be specific, right? What other possibilities are there? We could say this is Michelangelo's Last Judgment, right? This is Jesus, deciding, deliberating whether Michelangelo goes to heaven or hell. But also you could say this is maybe the Last Judgment of the church, right? This is the evaluating the Catholic Church, and maybe that was why it got a lot of criticism, because it felt like it was really, really too close to home. Right? And I think that's what's really so interesting about Michelangelo. The more I look at this, it really feels like he's using his celebrity and status to kind of criticize the church, even though it's not super clear. I don't mean the church, it's the Catholic Church, right? So you could see this as kind of like, it's not a Protestant Last Judgment, but I think it is more critical of the Catholic Church than meets the eye. But of course, as I said, we're going to shift to another era, kind of defined by Bernini and Caravaggio. There'll still be a lot of emotion, a lot of drama, but it will be kind of all really part of this reaction to the Renaissance and pushing the pendulum back towards more orderly, more kind of more church-focused, more no paganism, no nudity. But by that point, in the 1500s, we're going to be learning about, of course, about Columbus and the conversion of the New World of the Native Americans into Catholicism. And I'd say, arguably, at this point even, the real foundation of the church is shifting to the New World, to Latin America, because that's really going to be where I think the church gets a lot of its funding. I think even today, a lot of the funding for the Catholic Church comes from Latin America. But also, I think that's really just where the winds of change are going. Not just Latin America, of course, but the United States also becomes the sort of the recipient of Protestantism. And so, as Protestantism moves across the ocean to the New World and to the United States, I think a lot of the real spiritual winds move with them too. And of course, even a lot of the history of the modern era is kind of Spain and the United States resolving that Catholic versus Protestant, and even got John F. Kennedy was the first Catholic president, right? So I think the question we'll ask later is, as we move forward, is, well, the arts, are they, does Protestantism, is there a place for art in Protestantism? And I think it is, but as long as you understand that sort of the separation of church and state means you kind of, you're shifting away from the Catholic Church as an institution more towards art as kind of an ethical, moral kind of storytelling. And you could even say the children's movies, I think, are kind of a new kind of form of moral storytelling. And yeah, I think that's a good place to end. So I'll see you guys next Sunday, and we'll talk more about, I think, the New World then. Any questions?
No.
No?
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
And by the way, I want to say, it's really great to have adults, and not that my UT students aren't adults, I mean, debatable, but to have adults who are like, really excited about art history is a real treat for me. So thank you. It's really my first time really teaching art history to adults, and it really is a wonderful experience. So thank you.
That's great.